A quick note before we begin. This episode discusses the making of Sunset Boulevard, including references to some of its most iconic scenes. If you've never seen the film and would like to watch it first to avoid spoilers, we'll be here when you get back. And if you'd rather just jump in, that works too. Every episode of When They Were Making It is built to bring you into the story from the beginning. You don't need to know the film or the people behind it to enjoy the episode. Thank you. Evanston, Illinois, late 1949. Billy Wilder sits near the back of a darkened theater, waiting for an audience to see his newest film for the first time. For over a year, he's been building toward this moment. And this isn't just another picture. It goes deeper than that. This is the film into which he's poured every frustration, every argument, and every doubt he's ever carried about Hollywood. He's given everything to it. Fought with his longtime creative partner over almost every major decision. Brought one of silent Hollywood's greatest stars back to the studio she once ruled. Cast a struggling leading man as a struggling Hollywood writer. And turned the movie business itself into the setting, the subject, and the target. Now, at last, the film is finished and ready to be seen. The lights go down. The film begins. There's silence as the opening unfolds. It's strange and morbid, set inside a morgue where the dead begin talking among themselves. It's the strangest opening Wilder's ever built, and that's the point. It's meant to pull the audience immediately into the film's world, to tell them that this story will be dark, unsettling, and impossible to escape. Then, from somewhere in the theater, Wilder hears the first reaction. Someone laughs. Another person joins in. Soon, the reaction has spread across the room. By the end of the sequence, the entire theater is laughing. And as the movie moves beyond its opening, the laughter doesn't stop. It keeps coming, in the wrong places. Moments meant to unsettle are playing as comedy. Lines that felt sharp in the cutting room are falling flat. There's no mistaking it. The audience isn't laughing with the movie. They're laughing at it. Wilder sits in the darkness and feels himself growing hot. Scene by scene, minute by minute, he feels the picture slipping away from him. The performances are still there. The unease, the mansion, the shadows, the bitterness underneath the sly, pointed dialogue. But the room is gone. Wilder doesn't need comment cards or Paramount executives to explain what's happening. His film is collapsing in front of him. He leaves the auditorium and sits down on a staircase near the restrooms, trying to collect himself. As the picture continues inside, a woman who has also left the screening asks, as she passes him, whether he's ever seen such a terrible picture. Never, he replies. Sunset Boulevard, the film he was so sure about, has just crashed and burned with the first preview audience to see it. Sitting there on the steps, a year of work has come down to one brutal realization. Whatever Billy Wilder thought he'd made, the audience has just seen something completely different. And he has no idea what to do about it. Welcome to When They Were Making It. I'm your host, Patrick Rankin, and this is the podcast that dives deep into the glorious, often messy, and utterly human stories behind Hollywood's greatest films, and the legends who created them. Today, we're exploring Sunset Boulevard, the Hollywood classic that turned the camera back on the movie business, revealing the ambition, cruelty, and delusion behind the Dream Factory, and how it nearly fell apart before it ever got released. Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett did not particularly like each other. They just happened to work extremely well together, and for 12 years, that was enough. They'd been writing partners since 1936, forced together by a Paramount executive who thought the pairing might work. On paper, it shouldn't have. Brackett was East Coast gentility, Harvard-educated, refined, a former New Yorker drama critic who carried himself with the quiet authority of a man whose family had been in America since the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Wilder was none of those things. A brash Austrian emigre who had fled the Nazis and arrived in Hollywood barely speaking English, he had little patience for sentiment, direct and far less restrained than Brackett. Their working method reflected the contrast between them. Wilder paced the room with a swagger stick, cutting it through the air as ideas came to him. Brackett lay on the couch with a yellow legal pad, shaping the ideas into scenes. Life magazine, not exactly sincerely, called them the happiest couple in Hollywood. Many people simply referred to them as Brackett and Wilder, all one word, as if separating them, even grammatically, was impossible. The friction was constant, but the partnership produced an impressive run of films. Ninotchka in 1939, starring Greta Garbo and Melvyn Douglas, Ball of Fire in 1941 with Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck, The Major and the Minor in 1942, starring Ginger Rogers and Ray Milland, and in 1945, The Lost Weekend, a portrait of alcoholism starring Milland that won Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Screenplay. Wilder brought the edge, Brackett brought the structure, and together they developed a distinctive rhythm, brisk, layered, and emotionally precise. As a team, they received 5 Academy Award nominations and won twice. They had become one of the most successful writing partnerships in Hollywood. But by 1948, something was breaking down. The creative tension that had once helped drive the work was becoming increasingly personal. The war had changed Wilder. He had lost his mother, stepfather, and grandmother in the Holocaust, learning their fate only after the conflict ended. His work was becoming darker, more cynical, and less interested in the sophisticated comedy that had defined much of their partnership. More and more, Wilder seemed drawn to material with a sharper edge, something that cut. Brackett watched the shift with growing unease. The partner he had known for more than a decade, the one who balanced edge with elegance, was becoming harder to work with and increasingly difficult to be around. Soon, Wilder's darker outlook and his need to push beyond the polished comedies he'd been making found a subject to turn on. Not a literary adaptation or a story set somewhere safely removed. The subject was Hollywood itself. Wilder had begun noticing the silent era stars still living in the grand mansions along Sunset Boulevard and in the surrounding hills. men and women who had once been among the most famous people in the world and were now largely forgotten. He'd seen how some still lived as though the cameras were rolling, surrounded by photographs of their younger selves, speaking to servants with theatrical grandeur. The image stayed with him, former stars unable or unwilling to move forward. Then, in July 1948, director D.W. Griffith died. Griffith had done more than almost anyone to shape the early language of American cinema through his use of close-ups, cross-cutting, and feature-length storytelling. His legacy was also inseparable from the racism of The Birth of a Nation. He was found unconscious at the Knickerbocker Hotel, where he'd been living alone. He was 73. The memorial drew mourners, but relatively few of the industry's current power players attended. One of the central figures in the creation of American cinema had spent his final years largely forgotten by the business he had helped build. For Wilder, it reinforced something he had already begun to believe. Hollywood didn't spend much time looking back or honoring the people who had built it. It took what it needed, moved on, and left many of them behind. And that, he realized, was a story worth telling. He brought it to Brackett, a faded star from the silent era, once worshipped, now forgotten, who still believed the world was waiting for her return. Into her orbit would stumble a struggling young screenwriter, desperate enough to play along. At first, the concept was fairly light, something closer to dark comedy. Mae West and Marlon Brando were mentioned as potential leads. Brackett imagined a story where the aging star made a triumphant comeback. A satire, but not an especially cruel one. When the writing stalled, Wilder and Brackett brought in a third voice, D.M. Marshman Jr., a young Time magazine film critic whose blunt assessment of their recent work had impressed them enough to offer him a job. With Marshman in the room and Wilder's darker instincts driving the material, the comedy receded. The comeback became a delusion. The young writer wasn't just playing along, he was being kept, financially and sexually, and was too compromised to walk away. What had begun as satire was becoming something more unsettling. The characters began to take shape. Norma Desmond, a former silent film star, once among the biggest names in the world, now living inside a decaying mansion on Sunset Boulevard, with her photographs, her memories, and a butler who helped maintain the illusion that the public was still waiting for her. Joe Gillis, a broke Hollywood screenwriter running from debt collectors who stumbles into her life and agrees to rewrite Salome, the enormous script she believes will restore her to the screen. She would finance his life. He would encourage her fantasy. Neither would say out loud what the arrangement actually was. Then Wilder arrived at the idea that would define the film's tone. What if Joe Gillis narrated the story from beyond the grave? Wilder had come close to something similar in Double Indemnity, where a dying man records his confession. But this went further. Joe would not be dying. He would already be dead. From the opening minutes, the audience would know how his story ended. Everything that followed would be narrated by a man leading them toward a fate he had already reached. It wasn't a twist. It was a warning. As the writing continued, the story began to reflect something neither Wilder nor Brackett could entirely ignore. As the weeks turned into months, they found themselves writing about two people bound together by need rather than affection, each aware that the relationship had become damaging and neither quite able to end it. Brackett's diary entries laid it out plainly. A dull, lonely day at the studio. Its only happiness, the negative one, of not having to see and be in the room with and feel myself absorbed in the life of Wilder. Still, they kept working. The script became darker, harsher, and more personal than anything they had written together before. By now, it was no longer simply a dark comedy about an aging actress. It was a film about an industry that celebrated people while they were useful and forgot them when they were not. Which raised an obvious problem. How do you persuade Hollywood to finance a film about Hollywood's willingness to discard its own? Their previous film, A Foreign Affair, had been denounced on the floor of Congress, and that had been a gentle satire about occupation troops. If Paramount executives read this script in full, they'd kill it before a single frame was shot. If the Breen office, Hollywood's censorship body, saw where the story was headed, it might demand changes that would weaken it beyond recognition. So, they lied. The project was given a fake title, A Can of Beans, after a short story that didn't exist. Pages were submitted to both Paramount and the Breen office a few at a time, carefully chosen to prevent anyone from grasping the full picture. The script's actual cover page carried a warning. This is the first act of Sunset Boulevard. Due to the peculiar nature of the project, we ask all our coworkers to regard it as top secret. Based on the initial pages and the trust earned by The Lost Weekend, Paramount greenlit the production. The screenplay was barely a third complete. Even the people creating it could not say with certainty what the finished film would become. But its target was already unmistakable: the very industry that was producing it, Hollywood itself. Wilder and Brackett had their assignment. Now they needed their cast. With the script taking shape and Paramount's backing secured, Wilder turned to what they knew would be the most important decision of the production, and perhaps the most difficult: finding Norma Desmond. The role demanded something close to impossible: an actress with enough stature and presence to convincingly portray a woman who had once been the biggest star in the world, but who was also willing to admit, on screen, that those days were over, that she was old, that she was forgotten, and that, in the film's view, she was losing her grip on reality. It wasn't just a difficult role to cast, it was a difficult role to accept. Mae West was one of the first names discussed, back when the project was still conceived as something closer to dark comedy. But as the material darkened, West fell away. She had no interest in playing a has-been, and said so. The next name was almost inevitable: Greta Garbo. Garbo had been one of the defining stars of early sound cinema. Mysterious, distant, and unlike almost anyone else on screen. Her face had sold millions of tickets. Her name alone could fill theaters. And she and Wilder had history. He and Brackett had written Ninotchka for her in 1939. She'd ruled the screen, and then she was gone. In 1941, after the critical failure of Two-Faced Woman, Garbo had walked away from Hollywood. No interviews, no comebacks, no guest appearances. She never made another film. Casting her would have been a coup. One of the most famous faces in Hollywood history, returning to play a woman haunted by her own earlier fame. But Garbo wasn't interested. She said no. So they moved on. Next was Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, co-founder of United Artists, a towering figure of the silent era, as much a businesswoman as a star. By the late 1940s, she had retreated behind the walls of Pickfair, the Beverly Hills estate she'd shared with Douglas Fairbanks. Wilder and Brackett went there prepared to pitch her the role. But almost as soon as they sat down, Wilder could see the problem. Even aged and reclusive, Pickford still carried the wholesome sweetness that had made her famous. It was the opposite of the unstable, sexually possessive figure Wilder had in mind for Norma Desmond. He cut Brackett off before he could even begin the pitch. You couldn't ask America's sweetheart to play a woman who seduced a man half her age and then descended into madness. They left Pickfair without even telling her what the story was. The list kept shrinking. Norma Shearer was offered the role and turned it down. Clara Bow apparently didn't even entertain the conversation. Pola Negri was called on the telephone, but Wilder later claimed her Polish accent was so strong that he couldn't understand her. With each rejection, the same problem became clearer. They might have written a role no actress was willing to play. Then, one afternoon, Wilder found himself in George Cukor's garden. Cukor was one of Hollywood's most respected directors, known as the woman's director for his ability to draw strong performances from his actresses. His home in the Hollywood Hills was a regular gathering place for the industry's inner circle. Wilder, frustrated by the search, told him what had been happening. Cukor listened. Then he said, "Billy, I have the ideal Norma Desmond for you. Gloria Swanson." Wilder's reaction was telling. He'd somehow forgotten her, which was extraordinary in itself, because Gloria Swanson hadn't just been a silent film star. She'd been one of the defining faces of the era. By her early 20s, Swanson was Paramount's most bankable name, as famous for her films as for the elaborate life she lived away from them. At her peak, she received 10,000 fan letters a week, earned more than $1 million a year, and lived accordingly. A Beverly Hills mansion, Paris couture, gold-plated fixtures, and an entourage large enough to attract attention wherever she went. She'd made 6 films with industry great Cecil B. DeMille. She'd been nominated at the very first Academy Awards. By any measure, Gloria Swanson hadn't merely witnessed the rise of Hollywood. She'd helped define it. But then, gradually, it was over. A series of box office disappointments in the early 1930s, a disastrous production called Queen Kelly that left her financially exposed, and a shifting industry that no longer seemed interested in what she represented. By 1941, after one final unsuccessful return to the screen, Gloria Swanson was finished with Hollywood. She'd moved to New York and built a new life, hosting one of the first live television series, running a patents company, appearing on stage, designing clothes. She was busy, modern, and forward-looking. She hadn't sealed herself inside a mansion with her photographs and her delusions. She'd moved on. Of all the women Wilder had considered, Swanson may have been the one who most clearly understood what Norma Desmond couldn't. There was a future beyond Hollywood, even after Hollywood had moved on, which made asking her to return to that world a delicate proposition. But Swanson was intrigued. The script offered something her television and stage work didn't: a substantial dramatic role and a salary larger than anything she'd earned in some time. She agreed to come to Hollywood and discuss the project. But when Paramount asked her to screen test, she was furious. "I've made 20 films for Paramount," she said. "Why do they want me to audition?" It was George Cukor who persuaded her. "If they ask you to do 10 screen tests, you do 10 screen tests," he told her, "or I will personally shoot you." To Swanson, he'd become the project's strongest advocate and predicted boldly that Norma Desmond would be the role for which she was remembered. So Swanson did the test, and what Paramount saw convinced them. She was commanding, theatrical, and unsettling in exactly the way the role required. One observer later described the effect in a single word: monstrous. Swanson signed for $50,000. It was a fraction of what she'd earned at her peak. In her biggest years, it would have represented only a few weeks of work. But it was more than television was paying, and the role was quickly becoming more important than the money. Years later, Brackett would insist they'd never seriously considered anyone except Swanson, even if evidence did suggest they'd looked elsewhere. Wilder's own accounts insist they had. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last, that the two men remembered the same story differently. Regardless, with Swanson secured, they turned to the other half of the equation: Joe Gillis. Wilder's first choice was Montgomery Clift. At 28, Clift was one of the most sought-after young actors in Hollywood. Intense, striking, method-trained, and unusually independent. He'd repeatedly turned down long-term studio contracts. Red River, opposite John Wayne, had made him a star. The Search had earned him an Academy Award nomination. He was exactly the kind of talent that could hold the screen opposite Gloria Swanson. A deal was struck: $5,000 a week, 12 weeks guaranteed, $60,000 total. Clift was signed, and production had its leads. Then, 2 weeks before filming was scheduled to begin, Clift pulled out. His official explanation was that the role felt too similar to his part in The Heiress with Olivia de Havilland, another young man involved with an older woman. Wilder's response was immediate and furious. If he's any kind of actor, he could be convincing making love to any woman. But the real reason for exiting, it emerged, was more personal. Clift was involved with Libby Holman, a faded Broadway torch singer, 16 years his senior, whose past carried its own considerable scandal. In 1932, her young husband, tobacco heir Zachary Smith Reynolds, had been fatally shot under mysterious circumstances. Holman was indicted for murder before the charges were dropped. When she read the script, she reportedly saw an uncomfortable resemblance between Norma's relationship with Joe and her own relationship with Clift. By some accounts, she threatened to kill herself if Clift took the role. By others, Clift simply couldn't face the gossip the film might generate. Either way, the result was the same. He walked. Wilder was left without a leading man 2 weeks from production. He scrambled. Fred McMurray, who had starred in Wilder's Double Indemnity, turned it down. He didn't want to play a gigolo. Gene Kelly was considered, but MGM refused to loan him out. Marlon Brando was mentioned again, but was still considered too unfamiliar to mainstream movie audiences. Wilder needed someone for Joe Gillis, and he needed them now. So Paramount pointed him toward one of their own contract players, William Holden. Holden had once seemed destined for major stardom. In 1939, Columbia had cast the unknown 20-year-old in the lead of Golden Boy, choosing him over thousands of other actors. Barbara Stanwyck had championed him. Variety named him a young performer to watch. Then came the war. When he returned, the momentum was gone. For much of the next decade, he was stuck in what he called Smiling Jim roles, pleasant, undemanding parts that kept him employed without moving his career forward. By 1949, Holden badly needed something better. His career had stalled, his marriage was under strain, he was drinking too much. Wilder wasn't convinced. Holden looked older than he wanted for Joe. He seemed too conventional and too bland. But there was no one else, and production couldn't wait. Holden signed for $39,000, $21,000 less than Clift had been offered, a difference the studio kept to itself. Wilder had his two leads, a woman who'd lived through the decline of silent Hollywood and built a life beyond it, playing a woman who couldn't, and an actor whose own career uncertainty gave him a direct way into his character's desperation. During the time the two leads were still being worked out, the supporting cast had already begun to come together. Nancy Olson was cast as Betty Schaefer, a young writer who becomes close to Joe and represents almost everything Norma isn't. Olson was 21, still attending UCLA, when she was spotted in a campus production and signed to a Paramount contract for $300 a week. Around the studio, she was known as Wholesome Olson, and that was exactly what Wilder wanted. Her youth, directness, and ordinary appearance would stand in sharp contrast to Norma's carefully maintained theatricality. For the final major role, Wilder turned to someone with a direct history with Swanson, Erich von Stroheim. During the silent era, von Stroheim had been one of the most brilliant and impossible directors in Hollywood. His 1924 film, Greed, had been shot over nearly 200 days and ran for close to 9 hours in its original form. Even after the studio cut it drastically, it was widely regarded as one of the major achievements of silent cinema. Von Stroheim fought constantly with the executives trying to control his productions, and eventually they stopped hiring him. In 1928, he directed Gloria Swanson in Queen Kelly, an expensive production that spiraled out of control until Swanson shut it down and fired him. The film was never completed as he intended. It severely damaged Swanson financially and helped bring von Stroheim's directing career to an end. Now, more than 20 years later, he was cast as Max von Merling, Norma Desmond's butler, former husband, and former director. It was close to home, and it was meant to be. Wilder now had his principal cast. He just needed somewhere to put them. Before cameras could roll, Wilder needed to build Norma Desmond's world. And everything in that world revolved around a single location, the mansion. It couldn't feel like a movie set. It had to feel real. A house that had once belonged to someone important. A house that still carried the weight of that importance, even after the world had moved on. There were properties all across Los Angeles that could have worked, Large homes, expensive homes, homes that could pass for wealth. But wealth wasn't quite the point. The house needed to feel as though it had once been magnificent and had since been left behind. What they eventually chose was a mansion built in the early 1920s for an American industrialist once described as the richest man in Mexico. 14 bedrooms, Mediterranean revival, built on 4 full lots in one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods. But the house's first life had been strangely brief. Its owners moved out after barely a year. For long stretches, it sat empty, maintained but unused, and became known locally as the Phantom House. Even after J. Paul Getty bought it in the 1930s, he reportedly used it mainly to store art. By the time Wilder found it, the mansion had spent more years empty than occupied. It didn't look like a place someone lived. It looked like a place someone had left, which was exactly what Norma Desmond needed. Paramount made an arrangement with the property's owner. In exchange for using the house, the studio would build a swimming pool on the grounds. When production ended, the pool would remain. But the exterior was only half of it. The mansion's actual rooms were too small for the cameras, so the interiors were rebuilt on Paramount sound stages. That gave Wilder's art directors complete control over Norma's world. Heavy drapes blocked out the sun. Candelabras replaced electric lights. The rooms were crowded with ornate furniture, a gold-plated piano, a pipe organ, ship models, and a gilded boat-shaped bed that had already appeared in the 1925 version of The Phantom of the Opera. Photographs covered almost every surface. Real publicity stills from Gloria Swanson's silent film career. And Swanson contributed some of her own belongings to dress the set. Wilder and cinematographer John Seitz carried the same idea into the lighting. Seitz had filmed Rudolph Valentino during the silent era and understood the look Wilder wanted. Moody, shadowy, romantic. For certain scenes, he sprinkled aluminum dust in front of the lens, the same technique he'd used on Double Indemnity, giving the air inside the house a heavy stillness. Everything outside the mansion, Joe's apartment, the Paramount lot, the streets of Hollywood, was shot in flatter, harsher light, stark realism through and through. Norma's world belonged to another time, and it would need to look like it. The final piece was wardrobe. Edith Head, Paramount's chief costume designer, had been dressing the studio stars for more than 25 years. But Norma presented an unusual problem. How do you dress a woman who no longer seems to belong to any particular moment? Head ultimately built Norma's wardrobe around a single idea, not an era. This was a woman who was always performing, even when no one was watching. Her clothes wouldn't simply be frozen in the 1920s. They would follow the general silhouettes of the late 1940s. But everything would be pushed slightly too far. Too ornate, too dramatic, too deliberate for a woman with nowhere to go. Theatrical furs, oversized jewelry, an unfashionably long cigarette holder. There would also be echoes of Swanson's silent film image, including peacock feathers that recalled a costume she'd worn in Male and Female, the Cecil B. DeMille film that had helped define her image decades earlier. Head later called it the most challenging assignment of her career. Because Norma Desmond was an actress who had become lost in her own imagination, she said, "I tried to make her look like she was always impersonating someone." By contrast, Wilder told Nancy Olson to wear her own clothes on camera. Simple blouses, skirts, and sweaters she already owned. Betty Schaefer wasn't meant to look designed. She was meant to look exactly like what she was, a young woman who worked for a living. Just like in the set design, the real world would dress like the real world. Norma's world was pure theater. By the middle of April 1949, that world was ready. The sets were dressed, the costumes were ready, the cameras were in place. The script was another matter. Very little progress had been made on the writing while the production came together. The screenplay was still barely a third complete. Most of the middle remained unfinished, and the ending hadn't been written at all. The rest would have to be worked out as they went. Ready or not, it was time for Norma Desmond's close-up. Gloria Swanson hadn't set foot on the Paramount lot in more than 20 years. The studio she returned to in the spring of 1949 was running a promotional campaign, a celebration of its stars, which they had loosely tied to the centennial of the California Gold Rush. Near the front gate, a massive billboard depicted a comet blazing across the sky, trailing the faces of Paramount's biggest stars past and present. Their size and placement had been carefully calibrated to avoid bruising any egos. Bing Crosby couldn't appear ahead of Bob Hope. Barbara Stanwyck couldn't be placed above Betty Hutton. At the head of the comet, bigger than anyone, was Gloria Swanson. The studio's chief casting director explained the logic when she arrived. "Baby, am I glad to see you. You took me off a hell of a spot. If I'd put Crosby's picture on the front end of the comet, Hope would have blown his top. You turned out to be a real lifesaver." Swanson took it in stride. "That's when I knew I was home," she said. "Right back in the jungle, up to my ears in a rat race." She was home, and the lot received her accordingly. Electricians and grips who'd been there since the silent era came out to greet her. Men who remembered when Swanson had been one of Paramount's most valuable assets. Some had worked on her films. Others had simply watched her rise. For a moment, the 20 years between Swanson's silent era stardom and her return seemed to fall away. She walked the same streets and passed the same sound stages where she'd once been Paramount's biggest star. The production that had brought her back, still operating under the placeholder title A Can of Beans, carried its own gravity. People understood enough to know it mattered. Wilder was directing, Swanson was starring. Whatever it wasn't routine. Once the greetings ended and the lot's attention moved elsewhere, Swanson went to work. Holden had arrived only days before filming began, with little time to prepare and knowing he hadn't been the production's first choice. Von Stroheim brought more than 20 years of history with Swanson and a working relationship that was still settling into place. Nancy Olson, the youngest and least experienced member of the principal cast, found herself surrounded by performers whose careers had begun before she was born. Wilder walked them through the first scenes with his usual briskness. He read the dialogue once, set the blocking, and moved on. No long discussions, no speeches about motivation. He worked quickly, without ceremony, and expected the actors to keep up. Swanson was prepared from the beginning. She arrived with her lines learned and ready to work. When Wilder gave her direction, she took it. But when she offered something from her own experience, a gesture, a reading, a detail, Wilder listened. Holden approached the role differently. He was quieter and more watchful. He followed the blocking, hit his marks, and kept mostly to himself. Before filming had even begun, he'd admitted to Wilder that he didn't know how to play Joe Gillis. Wilder's answer was simple. Do you know Bill Holden? Well, sure. Then you know Joe Gillis. Wilder's point was clear. Holden didn't need to build Joe Gillis from scratch. He could begin with himself. So Holden showed up each morning, said his lines, and allowed some of his own weariness and uncertainty to enter the character. For Wilder, the cast was making his job easier. As a director, he had no patience for hand-holding, and this cast didn't seem to need much of it. He ran his set the way he ran every set. Fast, controlled, and with absolute authority over what the camera captured. His editorial supervisor, Doane Harrison, had taught Wilder a method known as cutting in the camera, planning each shot so precisely that the footage could only be edited together one way. It saved time, but it also protected Wilder from studio interference. By shooting only what he needed, a master, a few strategically placed close-ups, nothing extra, Wilder left the studio no alternative footage to rearrange later. What he printed would be the film, his film. For his actors, this meant there was almost no margin. One take, sometimes two, almost never more. Nancy Olson learned that in her first scene. She stumbled over a line, kept going, and waited for Wilder to call cut and let her try again. Instead, he said, cut, print. She asked for another take. Print, next setup. That was how the production moved. They worked through the early mansion scenes in sequence. The funeral, in which Norma buries her beloved pet chimp, Joe arriving at the house, and the arrangement between them beginning to take shape. Since the screenplay was still actively being written, the mansion scenes not only helped establish the film's emotional center, its atmosphere, the claustrophobic relationship between Norma and Joe, but they were also almost all the production had. Each morning, Wilder directed. Each evening, he sat down with Brackett and Marshman and wrote the film he was shooting, sometimes finishing pages the night before they were needed on set. The cast didn't know where the story was headed. Neither did Wilder. But the footage they had was working. The dailies were dark, strange, and anchored by performances that gave the material more weight than anyone had expected. But not everyone was convinced audiences would respond the same way. Brackett kept returning to one question. Who was this film for? They were making a picture that savaged the industry financing it. The people it depicted would see themselves in every frame, and they would not be flattered. General audiences had no particular reason to care about the internal politics of a business they experienced only through the finished product. And every week, Wilder pushed the material further. The comedy they'd originally envisioned, sharp, pointed, not without affection, was long gone. What was replacing it was harder, stranger, and crueler. A dead man narrating his own murder, a delusional woman descending into madness, a kept man too weak to leave. Brackett could see the quality in what they were making. He was the one who had recognized the power of lines like, "I am big, it's the pictures that got small," and by his own account, rehearsed the line with Swanson himself until the delivery was right. He knew the performances were strong. He knew Wilder was getting something unusual on film. He just wasn't sure anyone would want to watch it. He wasn't alone. On May 2nd, watching rushes just a few weeks into production, Marshman said what had been hanging over the writing room for days. It just occurred to me this can be a picture that nobody will like. Still, the writing continued, and the relationship between Wilder and Brackett continued to deteriorate. Brackett's diary from the period recorded stalled and agonized days, and described Wilder as being in one of his preposterous moods, a mood of resentment and suffering, brooding angrily most of the time. For now, the work was still holding them together, but only just. Back on the soundstage, Swanson and Holden had settled into very different positions within the production. They were cordial and professional, but not especially close. They worked their scenes, took direction, and moved on without lingering. Swanson was comfortable challenging creative decisions. The makeup department had planned to emphasize the age difference between Norma and Joe by making Swanson look older. But she argued that Norma, with her vanity and money, would have done everything possible to preserve her appearance. Instead, Wilder had the makeup department make Holden look younger. Holden, for his part, showed up, hit his marks, and followed Wilder's direction. In the dailies, the contrast worked. Norma dominated, Joe reacted. On camera, Holden was delivering. Away from it, his personal life was becoming more difficult. His marriage was under strain, and his drinking was getting worse. Each morning before leaving for the studio, he reportedly called ahead to his assistant with a standing request: warm the ice cubes. Have a drink waiting when he arrived. Nancy Olson saw both sides of him. They spent long hours together on the Paramount backlot, filming the quiet conversations that offered Joe his only possible way out of Norma's mansion. Off camera, there was warmth between them. Bill and I love to kiss, Olson said later, with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. But she could also see what he was dealing with. His marriage was not glued together, really, she said. It was falling apart, and he was drinking too much at that time. Wilder had told Holden that he already understood Joe Gillis. By now, it was easier to see what he'd meant, and Wilder was capturing what he could of it on film. But if Holden brought his demons to the set quietly, Erich von Stroheim brought his openly. Von Stroheim knew that his history with Swanson, and with the industry that had pushed him out of directing, was part of the reason Wilder had cast him. As he reportedly remarked of Wilder, likes his actors true to type, does he not? Whatever resentment had remained between him and Swanson after Queen Kelly, they'd largely put it aside. On set, they fell into an easy professional rhythm. Two people with a complicated professional history who saw little reason to revisit it. But von Stroheim was never going to be a passive presence. He'd spent years as a director controlling nearly every aspect of his productions. That instinct hadn't disappeared. Throughout filming, von Stroheim offered ideas for the character and the story. He suggested revealing that Max was the one writing Norma's fan letters, fabricating an audience that no longer existed, and helping sustain the illusion that she was still remembered. Wilder used it immediately. Von Stroheim was reportedly also the one who proposed using actual footage from Queen Kelly, the unfinished production whose collapse had ended his partnership with Swanson, for the scene in which Norma screens one of her old films. Wilder used that too, giving American audiences their first glimpse of the doomed production. Not every suggestion survived. Von Stroheim proposed a scene in which Max hand-washed and ironed Norma's underwear, caressing the fabric with fetishistic care. Wilder declined. Even Sunset Boulevard had limits. The weeks continued. 6-day schedules on the Paramount sound stages, Wilder printing takes and moving forward. New pages arriving as the film was being shot. And around the lot, people began to talk. The secrecy surrounding the project was becoming harder to maintain. By now, rumors containing pieces of truth had begun to spread. Wilder was making a film about Hollywood itself, one that wasn't especially flattering. By the middle of production, the dailies had become one of the most sought-after screenings on the Paramount lot. People from other productions found reasons to be nearby. The full story was still unclear, but word was getting out. Whatever Wilder was building behind closed doors, Sunset Boulevard, what the project was now known to actually be called, was going to be something nobody had seen before. And no one on the Paramount lot, or in Hollywood for that matter, knew what was coming. By the time production entered its 5th week, the crew had grown accustomed to Wilder's pace, his preference for first takes, and the long days that moved quickly because he rarely allowed anyone to linger. The mansion sets that had seemed so strange during the first week were now simply where they worked. Lighting setups moved faster, camera positions became familiar, and Gloria Swanson had settled fully into the role. The discipline had been there from the first day. The preparation, the precision, the instinct for how Norma moved through a room. But as filming continued, traces of the character began following her away from the soundstage. Swanson was living with her mother and her daughter Michelle during the production. Michelle would later remember Swanson coming home, still walking with Norma's deliberateness and speaking in the same measured cadence. Swanson didn't appear to be consciously performing. She simply hadn't left all of Norma at the studio. At the same time, the production was drawing more and more heavily on what Swanson remembered. Swanson helped Edith Head refine her costume designs through small adjustments in silhouette, jewelry, and gesture. She was creating a past that she knew and I didn't, Head later said. This type of collaboration was becoming one of the film's great advantages. The people making Sunset Boulevard didn't have to invent every detail of silent Hollywood. Some of the people who had lived through it were standing in front of and behind the camera. For one scene, Norma's old friends from the silent era gather around a card table in her mansion while Joe watches from across the room. He calls them the Waxworks. Wilder didn't cast actors pretending to be forgotten silent stars. He cast the real ones. Buster Keaton, one of the defining comedians of the silent era, now working at MGM as a gag consultant. H.B. Warner, who'd played Jesus Christ in Cecil B. DeMille's The King of Kings, and was still picking up small roles in his 70s. And Anna Q. Nilsson, who at her peak had received 30,000 fan letters a month before a riding accident interrupted her career. Nilsson had been a last-minute addition. Brackett had spent the previous afternoon calling silent icons Theda Bara, who refused, and Jetta Goodall, who also refused. The next morning, Swanson, Keaton, Nielsen, and Warner took their places around Norma's card table. After the first take, Keaton looked around the group. Waxworks is right. The silent era entered the film in smaller ways too. For a scene in which Norma and Joe danced the tango in the mansion's ballroom on New Year's Eve, cinematographer John Seitz returned to a camera movement he'd used nearly 30 years earlier. He mounted the camera on a small wheeled dolly and moved with the actors as they crossed the floor. Seitz had used the same method in 1921 while filming Rudolph Valentino's tango in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the scene that had helped make Valentino a star. Swanson had later appeared opposite Valentino in Beyond the Rocks in 1922. Wilder wrote the reference directly into the script. Valentino said there's nothing like tile for the tango, Norma tells Joe. By then, Sunset Boulevard wasn't simply recreating old Hollywood. It was using the people, memories, and techniques that had survived it. And outside of Swanson, nowhere was that clearer than when Cecil B. DeMille agreed to play himself. DeMille wasn't just another director. He was one of the architects of the industry itself, a founding figure at Paramount, a man whose name had been synonymous with spectacle since the silent era. He directed Swanson at the height of her fame and helped shape the screen image that made her one of the most famous women in the world. Unlike many of the silent era figures around him, DeMille was still one of Hollywood's most famous and successful directors. In the scene, Norma visits him on the Paramount lot, convinced he is preparing to direct her comeback as Salome. DeMille receives her warmly, while carefully avoiding telling her that the studio has no interest in the script. DeMille charged $10,000 plus a new car for the appearance. The scene would be filmed on the soundstage where he'd been filming his most recent film, Samson and Delilah. Their real way of addressing each other was written directly into the script. Swanson called him Mr. DeMille. He called her young fella. The sequence also drew on the reception Swanson had received weeks earlier when she arrived on the Paramount lot. Crew members turning, heads lifting, word spreading across the soundstage. Miss Desmond is here. The DeMille sequence wrapped after 4 days. The production pushed on. By now, the script had entered its darkest material. Norma's suicide attempt, Joe reaching the point where he can no longer easily leave, the fantasy of a comeback moving closer to disaster. And the two men writing it were finding it increasingly difficult to work together. For 12 years and 13 films, the tension between Wilder and Brackett had been their engine, often strengthening their work. But during Sunset Boulevard, it had escalated past anything that had come before. Screaming matches, things hurled across the office, walkouts that felt less and less like they'd end with someone coming back. The arguments began to center on the film itself and revealed how differently the two men understood a film that was quickly nearing its finish line. They clashed over a sequence in which Norma undergoes hours of cosmetic treatments while preparing for a comeback that will never happen, the camera showing every procedure without sentiment. Brackett believed the scene treated her desperation cruelly. Wilder believed it showed the truth. They also fought over the opening, in which Joe Gillis narrates from a slab in the morgue. Wilder felt it was a moment of absolute truth. The story was about death. Brackett thought it was unnecessarily grotesque. By then, it wasn't always clear whether they were still arguing to improve the film's script or simply arguing because neither one could stand to let the other win. But in July, the final pages were delivered. The screenplay was complete, and they'd managed to get it past Hollywood's production censors with relatively few changes. Submitting the script gradually had worked. Along the way, only minor changes had been required. A line here, a phrase there. Nothing structural, nothing that altered the film's meaning. The production code, of course, required that Norma and Joe's relationship could not be presented as explicitly sexual or made to seem desirable. But the script already treated their arrangement as degrading. Joe wasn't swept away by Norma. He became dependent on her, resented it, and was ultimately killed trying to leave. With the script finished, production entered its final days. They filmed Joe's attempt to escape, Norma's desperation, and the confrontation and murder the story had been building toward. And then it was time for the staircase. The scene was Norma Desmond's last. Police and reporters have filled the mansion after Joe's death, and newsreel cameras are waiting at the foot of the staircase. But Norma no longer understands they're there to arrest her. Max tells her that the cameras are ready, and she believes Cecil B. DeMille has finally come to film her return. She begins to descend the staircase as Salome, performing the comeback she's imagined for years and has had Joe write for her. Wilder played Strauss's Dance of the Seven Veils on the soundstage, the music from Salome, to help Swanson through the scene. It was a technique carried over from silent filmmaking, when music was often played during shooting to guide the actor's mood. The camera began wide, then as Swanson descended the staircase, it moved closer. The focus softened, and by the time she reached the bottom, Norma's face filled the frame. She looked directly into the lens and said, "All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up." Wilder called cut. For a moment, the soundstage remained silent. Then the crew applauded, and Swanson began to cry. Wilder threw a party on the spot. It wouldn't be the last thing they would film. There was still more remaining on the schedule. But it was Norma Desmond's ending, and he wanted to mark it. The remaining days passed quickly. The final setups, the last takes. Then, on June 18th, 1949, filming ended. Swanson's daughter, Michelle, had grown used to seeing traces of Norma follow her mother through the door each night. But when Swanson came home for the final time, to the house she shared with her mother and daughter, Michelle immediately noticed something was different. Swanson confirmed it. There are only 3 of us in it now. For the first time in months, Norma Desmond hadn't come home with her. With filming complete, Billy Wilder briefly stepped away from Sunset Boulevard. On June 30th, 1949, he married Audrey Young in a small civil ceremony in Linden, Nevada. Young was a Paramount contract player and former singer with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. They'd met 5 years earlier on the set of The Lost Weekend, where she'd been cast as a hat check girl. Her scene was cut, leaving only her hand in the finished film. By then, Wilder had been in America for 15 years. He'd arrived with little money, barely any English, and no certainty about what kind of future he could build there. Now, he was one of Paramount's most successful filmmakers. He was newly married, and he'd just completed what he believed was the best film he'd ever made. Newly married and riding high, he arrived back in Los Angeles shortly after the wedding and turned his full attention to post-production of Sunset Boulevard. Wilder's habit of filming only what he needed made the editing process relatively straightforward. As Wilder liked to say, all he left on the cutting room floor were cigarette butts, chewing gum wrappers, and tears. Through August, September, and October, Wilder worked with his longtime editorial supervisor, Doan Harrison, and editor Arthur Schmidt to refine the picture. At the same time, Franz Waxman was composing the score. Waxman built it around three distinct musical ideas. Norma was given a tango, rooted in the 1920s and becoming more distorted as her state of mind deteriorated. Joe was represented by jazz, confident and slightly cynical at first, then gradually diminished as Norma's world closed around him. And for Joe and Betty's scenes on the Paramount backlot, Waxman transformed the familiar march used by Paramount newsreel into a love theme. Their relationship developed on the studio lot, so the studio's own music became theirs. It was a joke almost no one outside Paramount would recognize. By November, editing was finished. They had a cut. The score was in. Sunset Boulevard was ready to face the public. Paramount scheduled a test screening in Evanston, Illinois, to get the reaction from a non-Hollywood audience. Wilder traveled there to see the response himself. Whatever doubts had been swirling around the production, Brackett's worried that nobody would want to sit through the film, that Hollywood would be furious, that general audiences had no reason to care about the internal politics of a business they never saw. None of it seemed to matter anymore. Wilder had seen the cut. He knew what they had. The performances, the atmosphere, the dead man walking you through his own murder. It was unlike anything he or anyone else had made. Brackett could have his reservations. The film would speak for itself. In Evanston, the lights went down, the film began, and from the start, the preview was a complete disaster. The audience began treating the film like a joke from the opening scene. They laughed throughout, mostly in the wrong places. They barely responded to lines that had felt razor sharp in the cutting room. They met the moments Wilder had expected to unsettle them with something that seemed like confusion. To Wilder, sitting in the back, it quickly became clear. The audience wasn't finding its rhythm with the film. The picture and the people watching it appeared to be moving in two completely different directions. Wilder left the theater defeated and returned to Los Angeles shaken. He had spent more than a year on Sunset Boulevard. He had fought for its tone, its performances, its bitterness, and its strange balance between comedy and something much darker. He had believed completely in what they'd made. Now, it seemed clear that the film simply wasn't working. As Wilder, Brackett, and Paramount tried to understand what had gone wrong, further previews followed. None of them provided the clear reassurance the studio needed. Audiences were still struggling to find their way into the picture, but no one could yet agree on why. There were quiet rumors of shelving the picture entirely. writing off the more than $1.5 million it had cost to make and moving on. Sunset Boulevard was already a risky picture, one that might anger the industry it depicted. If audiences weren't responding either, Paramount had little reason to invite the controversy. For a time, the questions grew larger. Was the film too strange? Too morbid? Too concerned with Hollywood? Had its comedy overwhelmed the tragedy? Then, gradually, Wilder began to isolate the moment when the audience had turned against the picture. And he realized the moment happened almost immediately. The film opened in the Los Angeles County morgue. Joe Gillis's body, still wet from Norma Desmond's swimming pool, was delivered on a coroner's wagon and wheeled into a room filled with corpses beneath sheets. Then, the dead began talking. They exchanged stories about how they'd arrived there. A man expressed surprise that a Hollywood writer had ended up among them. And Joe began narrating his own murder. Wilder loved the sequence. It was, to him, incredible. Brackett had opposed it from the beginning, finding it too morbid. Wilder had written it without him and remained convinced that it was bold and unlike anything audiences had seen. But when it appeared on screen, the reaction was immediate and undeniable. Laughter. And not polite or uneasy laughter, not even nervous laughter. Guffaws. Loud, unselfconscious, sustained. The audience had decided in the first few minutes that they were watching a farce, something not to be taken seriously. From that point on, the film couldn't recover. Every scene that followed, the mansion, Joe's entrapment, the growing pressure around him, played to an audience that had already decided what kind of picture it was watching. The opening was supposed to draw the audience in. Instead, it was pushing them away. It had to go. It was, by Wilder's own account, one of the hardest decisions he ever made. He considered it among the finest things he'd ever put on film. But it was clear they were going to have to find another way in. What Wilder finally settled on had been there from the beginning. The pool. Norma Desmond's swimming pool. The one Paramount had built on the mansion grounds during principal photography. The murder scene. The image the whole story pivoted around. He didn't need a morgue. He had something better. Something specific, something cinematic, and something that wouldn't invite a single laugh. A body face down in a swimming pool at dawn. But if the pool was going to replace the morgue, if this was now going to be the first image of the film, Wilder knew it couldn't be routine. It had to seize the audience and declare immediately that they were in unfamiliar territory. Simply showing a body floating in water, the footage they currently had, wouldn't be enough. Wilder decided he wanted to shoot Holden's body from below, a fish-eye's view looking up through the water at the floating corpse, the police gathered at the pool's edge above. One image that explained everything. Death, spectacle, voyeurism. Hollywood looking down at one of its own. So, on January 5th, 1950, Wilder returned to the mansion with a small crew to film the new opening. They immediately encountered a problem. Seen from beneath, the surface of the water acted like a mirror. The camera couldn't clearly capture what was happening above it. So unit art director John Meehan devised a solution. An 8 by 6 foot dance rehearsal mirror was submerged in the pool. The camera remained above the water and filmed the scene through the reflection in the mirror. A muslin canopy behind the police officers created the appearance of a pre-dawn sky. The pool was filtered for clarity and kept at around 40 degrees. Holden floated face down in the cold water while Wilder captured the shot. The new opening was tested, and this time it worked. The sirens, the body in the pool, and Joe's voice describing his own death immediately told the audience what kind of film they were watching. The comedy in the film remained, but the tone was clear. The rest of the picture finally held together. And once that clicked, everything changed. The uncertainty that had shadowed the production, the worry that the film was too strange, too sharp, too inside, began to fall away. What Paramount had was good. This wasn't an eccentric gamble. It wasn't a private joke about Hollywood that no one else would understand. It worked. Paramount began preparing for the release, and the studio embraced what it had previously approached carefully. This was a film about Hollywood. The tagline was blunt and deliberate, a Hollywood story. Rather than disguise the film's subject, Paramount made it the center of the campaign. Life magazine ran a major feature 2 months before the premiere. It was decided that Gloria Swanson would embark on a promotional tour covering 33 American cities, a silent-era star promoting her return in a film about a silent-era star attempting a comeback. The parallels became part of the campaign. Before the film's public release, Paramount arranged a private screening for the industry. The buzz surrounding Sunset Boulevard had been building for months, and by then, it had become impossible to ignore by everyone that mattered. Paramount invited 300 of Hollywood's most powerful figures into a screening room on the lot for what had become one of the season's hottest tickets. Studio heads, directors, stars, survivors of the silent era, now seated to watch a film about what had become of them. The lights went down, the sirens began, Holden's body appeared in the pool, and for the first time, Hollywood watched Sunset Boulevard. The audience responded strongly. When Swanson descended the staircase in the final scene, the room erupted in applause. Actress Barbara Stanwyck reportedly made her way through the crowd to Swanson. When she reached her, she knelt down and kissed the hem of Swanson's gown. Swanson looked for Mary Pickford. The two women had once been among the most powerful figures in silent Hollywood. Swanson wanted to know how the film had affected someone who'd experienced the same rise and the same disappearance of the world that had made them famous. But Pickford wasn't in the room anymore. According to the message passed to Swanson, she'd been too overwhelmed by the film to remain. But the film had not moved everyone in the same way. In the screening room, MGM chief Louis B. Mayer began loudly denouncing Billy Wilder. He accused Wilder of disgracing the industry that had made and supported him, and reportedly said he should be driven out of Hollywood, even out of the country. According to one version of the exchange, Mayer demanded, "How dare this young man, Wilder, bite the hand that feeds him?" Wilder heard him and walked over. "I am Mr. Wilder," he reportedly said, "and go fuck yourself." The industry had seen Sunset Boulevard. It had reacted loudly. Now, it was time to see what the rest of America would do. On August 10th, 1950, Sunset Boulevard opened at Radio City Music Hall in New York City, then one of the most prestigious first-run movie theaters in the country. King Kong had premiered there, so had Rebecca. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had made its New York debut there. Now the theater was showing a film that spent 2 hours examining the industry behind it with very little sentiment. In its first week, Sunset Boulevard set a new non-holiday house record, earning $166,000. The reviews were immediate and largely enthusiastic. On the day of its opening, Thomas Pryor of the New York Times called it a motion picture classic. 2 weeks later, Bosley Crowther described it as ruthlessly candid and wrote that it continued twisting and gnawing in the mind after the film ended. Time magazine summed up the response. A story of Hollywood, mostly at its worst, brilliantly told by Hollywood at its best. There were dissenters. The New Yorker dismissed it as a pretentious slice of Roquefort. But most critics recognized that Wilder had made something unusual, maybe even special. The box office response was less consistent. In major cities, the film broke records. In smaller towns, it often performed below average. The Hollywood setting, the industry politics, the distance of the silent era, it didn't seem to resonate with audiences who largely seemed to go to the movies to escape. Even so, Paramount expanded the release by another 400 cities. Sunset Boulevard eventually earned approximately $2.3 million domestically. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it had made its mark. And awards attention was already beginning to build. The National Board of Review named Sunset Boulevard the best film of 1950, and Swanson its best actress. The Golden Globes followed in February, with 4 awards, including Best Picture, Director, and Score. It looked, heading into Oscar season, like the field was Sunset Boulevard's to lose. Then, All About Eve arrived. Joseph L. Mankiewicz's story followed an established Broadway actress, played by Bette Davis, and the ambitious young woman moving into her life, played by Anne Baxter. It was another story about performance, age, ambition, and the fear of being replaced. When the Academy Award nominations were announced, All About Eve received 14, a record that would stand for nearly 50 years. Sunset Boulevard received 11. William Holden, Gloria Swanson, Erich von Stroheim, and Nancy Olson were all nominated, making it only the 5th film to receive nominations in all 4 acting categories. The 2 films were now competing directly in several of the night's biggest categories: Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actress, where Gloria Swanson and Bette Davis would be facing off directly. On March 29, 1951, the 23rd Academy Awards were held at the RKO Pantages Theater in Hollywood. But Swanson wasn't there. Her cross-country tour had ended, and she was now performing 8 shows a week on Broadway in 20th Century, opposite Jose Ferrer, who would win Best Actor that night for Cyrano de Bergerac. After the curtain came down, they went to La Zambra, a flamenco nightclub on 52nd Street, and listened to the ceremony on the radio. Judy Holliday, who was also up for Best Actress, was at the same table. All eyes were, arguably, on one award that night: Best Actress. It had come down, most people thought, to Swanson and Davis, two legends, two major stars from earlier generations, both playing actresses confronting the possibility that the industry was moving on without them. When the award was announced, it was Holliday who won, for Born Yesterday. The press gathered at the nightclub, hoping for a reaction from Swanson. She crossed the room, found Holliday, and congratulated her. "Judy, bless your heart," she said. "It's just as well I didn't win. It would have meant I have nothing to look forward to in life." Sunset Boulevard won 3 of its 11 nominations: Best Screenplay, Best Art Direction, and Best Score. All About Eve won Best Picture and Best Director. By the end of award season, Sunset Boulevard had survived nearly every concern surrounding it. The industry hadn't buried it. Audiences hadn't rejected it. Sunset Boulevard had succeeded. And then the people who made it moved on. For Billy Wilder, Sunset Boulevard marked the end of one partnership and the beginning of another phase of his career. He never worked with Charles Brackett again. His first film without Brackett, Ace in the Hole, failed on its original release, but was later reassessed as one of his most uncompromising pictures. Then came Stalag 17, Sabrina, The 7-Year Itch, and Some Like It Hot. With IAL Diamond, Wilder found another major writing partnership. Their film The Apartment won Best Picture and Best Director in 1961. Wilder later called it the film he'd made with the fewest faults. Charles Brackett moved to 20th Century Fox, won another Academy Award, and served as president of the Academy. But he reportedly described the end of his partnership with Wilder as an unexpected blow from which he never fully recovered. Gloria Swanson received a series of scripts attempting to repeat Norma Desmond. She called them pale imitations. After one unsuccessful film, she again moved largely away from Hollywood. She continued acting on stage and television, launched a clothing line, became an early advocate for health food, and published a best-selling autobiography. She always insisted that she was nothing like Norma Desmond. Wilder disagreed. There was a lot of Norma in her, he said. For William Holden, Sunset Boulevard changed the direction of his career. 3 years later, he won the Academy Award for Stalag 17. He became one of Hollywood's biggest box office stars and appeared in The Bridge on the River Kwai, The Wild Bunch, and Network. But his problems with alcohol continued. In 1981, Holden died alone in his apartment from injuries sustained when he fell and struck his head after drinking heavily. Wilder later said, "What a lousy fade out for a great guy." Erich von Stroheim returned to Europe, where his work as a director remained highly respected, particularly in France, where he was revered as an auteur. He died in 1957, decorated with the Legion of Honor. Despite the acclaim surrounding his performance in Sunset Boulevard, he reportedly referred to it as that goddamn butler role for the rest of his life. As for Nancy Olson, Sunset Boulevard changed the way she saw Hollywood. She was 22 when the film came out. She earned an Oscar nomination, married lyricist Alan J. Lerner, worked steadily, and gradually stepped away from leading roles. She later credited the movie with helping her make that decision. "I don't want to be a movie star," she said. "I'll be thrown away someday, just as Gloria Swanson was." As for Sunset Boulevard itself, its reputation continued to grow. In 1989, it was included among the first films selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. The American Film Institute later ranked it among the greatest American films ever made. 2 of Norma Desmond's lines appeared on its list of the greatest movie quotations. "All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up," at number 7, and "I am big, it's the pictures that got small," at number 24. In 1993, Andrew Lloyd Webber transformed it into a stage musical. The following year, Glenn Close brought Norma Desmond to Broadway, once again descending the staircase before a standing audience. At one performance, Billy Wilder himself was brought on stage at the curtain call at 88 years old. By then, the film had long outgrown its original release. Revived, reinterpreted, quoted, preserved, and passed from one generation to the next. Nancy Olson later offered the simplest explanation for why it endured. "A great work of art reveals the truth. Sunset Boulevard had done exactly that." What had begun as a film about the way Hollywood discarded its own history, its glamour, the machinery behind it, and what happened after the spotlight moved elsewhere, had itself become part of that history. Sunset Boulevard held up a mirror to the industry that created it, and the reflection wasn't flattering. But instead of turning away, Hollywood embraced it. Because sometimes, even the most uncomfortable reflection is impossible to ignore. That's a wrap on this week's episode of When They Were Making It, and our look behind the scenes of Sunset Boulevard. I'm Patrick Rankin, writer, producer, and your host. Original artwork by Simone Beach, and original music by Lionel Zablat. Thank you for listening and for helping keep these stories alive. Check out our Patreon, When They Were Making It, the backlot, at patreon.com/whentheywermakingit, or through the link in the show notes. There, you'll find companion episodes exploring each main feed subject, bonus audio stories, monthly Q&As, and 2 full-length bonus episodes. Grace Kelly, the movie star and Hitchcock muse who became a princess, and Barbara Stanwyck, the pre-code firebrand who became one of Hollywood's most enduring stars. We also post a visual companion for each episode on Instagram, with images, added context, and another side of the story. We're at When They Were Making It on Instagram and TikTok. And if you're enjoying the show, please follow us in whatever app you're listening in. It means every new episode lands automatically, and it's the clearest sign to Apple and Spotify that these stories are finding an audience. But the honest truth is, a show like this doesn't grow through ads or algorithms. It grows because one person hears it and tells another. So if this was worth your time, tell someone. That does more than anything else. Until next time, keep watching, and remember, behind every great film is an even greater story.